All right, so today we are taking our chapter on memory a step further. When we talked yesterday or the day before on information processing, we talked about how there were 3 steps to information processing. First being encoding, second being storage, and third being retrieval. So today when we talk specifically about encoding, we're going to delve into how we encode information so that we can later store it and retrieve it. When you look at the pictures of the eye and the ear, we know that encoding does involve using our senses. We encode information through visual means, auditory means, touch, taste, and smell. And oftentimes, the more senses we use, the more deeply we encode the information. So there are different types of encoding, and I'll list them here, and then we'll talk about each one of them. When we encode things acoustically, we oftentimes take them in through our ear, our sense of hearing, and we encode it by listening. Sometimes we encode things acoustically by saying something out loud. I know for me, if I want to remember something and it's important, I will say it out loud. I'll repeat it to myself, and I can hear myself say it. And that oftentimes will help with the encoding process. I'm a very visual person, so visual encoding is mental pictures and imagery. And our mental encoding can be a lot of different things. But if we have a visual of it, if we can mentally picture or imagine what it is, we oftentimes have a good ability to retrieve it when we need it. Another thing that is important is what's called semantic encoding. And this is when we give meaning to the information that we're processing. And that's very important too. Oftentimes in class, we'll say to you, hey, if you can think of something that makes sense to you, by all means, use that mnemonic device. Use that way of encoding it so that you can find it meaningful, you'll be able to retrieve it. Sometimes my mnemonic devices don't oftentimes work because there's something that I made. If you make up your own mnemonic device, it can be helpful. And by giving it meaning, we find that we can retrieve it easier. The self-reference effect is also a type of semantic encoding, and that's when you make it personal. So if I'm talking about something and I give my example, if you can think of your own example that you can identify with and you can relate to, you find personal meaning in it, that is going to be very helpful. So that's important to understand, is that the senses that we take in, whether it's acoustic or visual, or whether or not we've given it meaning, and even more personal, the self-reference effect, we're going to be able to encode it with a deep meaning that allows for us to store it for longer periods of time and allows for us to have an easier ability to retrieve it. So those are the 3 types of encoding: acoustic, visual, and semantic. Some of the information that we encode happens automatically without any kind of conscious effort. And sometimes it's incidental information, that of time, space, and oftentimes frequency. So when we automatically process something, let's use space for example. Sometimes while you're reading in your textbook, you'll encode the place on the page where your certain material appears. And later when you're trying to recall the information, you can actually visualize the location in your book or in your notes. And so that was something we unconsciously encoded. We didn't even think about it. But it's very helpful with school if you're trying to think of a vocab word and you can see it in the book, or you can see it in your notes or your index cards. Unconscious encoding of time. Sometimes when you go about your day, you'll unintentionally notice the sequence of the day's events. Later, when you realize maybe you left your phone in a classroom, you can recreate the sequence of what you did that day and you can retrace your steps. And that oftentimes helps. with retrieving the information you need. And with frequency, sometimes you automatically keep track of how many times something happens in a day. Sometimes you'll run into people and you'll be like, wow, this is the third time I've seen you in one day. And oftentimes maybe you won't run into that person for a week. So that's an example of some of the information that we automatically process. But sometimes it does require effort. In fact, a lot of times information requires conscious attention and effort to process it. And that's oftentimes what we find to be true in school. So we're going to talk specifically about effortful processing with rehearsal, the spacing effect, and the serial position effect. Let's start off with rehearsal. Rehearsal is the conscious repetition of information, either to maintain it in consciousness or to encode it for storage. So sometimes we'll rehearse something really quickly, like let's say somebody wants to have you pick them up a Subway sandwich at Subway, and they'll rattle off a list of items they want on their turkey sub. And you'll rehearse it, and you'll just say it out loud so that you can remember what the order is. And sometimes you rehearse it for deeper meaning. You will, let's use our vocabulary in psychology, you will go over 10, 15, 20 times before the quiz so that you have rehearsed it when you get the quiz, you'll be able to retrieve it with accuracy. You can see by the example on this slide, it says, take out a scratch sheet of paper and write the lyrics to the song, The 12 Days of Christmas. Ready, go. Well, the idea is that you are going to remember the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, first day of Christmas, second day of Christmas, third day of Christmas, fourth day, because you, in that song, repeat them over and over and over again. You're probably going to have a more difficult time remembering on the 12th day of Christmas or the 11th day of Christmas. So that just gives you an idea of how rehearsal and repetition allows for you to encode information. Here is the list, by the way. You're going to have an easier time recalling 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree versus 12 drummers drumming, 11 pipers piping, 10 lords leaping. You get my point. The spacing effect is the tendency for distributed steadier practice to yield better long-term retention than is achieved through massed steadier practice, the latter being cramming it in. And so we do talk about how in school it is so much better for you to pay attention to the reading pages that we assign and to evenly divide them. When you try and read the whole chapter the night before you take the chapter test, it's not going to be as easy to recall that massed amount of information if you can spread it out. Just like ideally, you will break up your studying for the vocabulary. We'll go over 5 terms today. You go home. You rehearse those. Maybe the next day we'll add 5 more terms. So then you're studying and rehearsing the 5 from the previous day and adding another 5. And you can do that all the way up leading to Friday's quiz. That's ideal. Trying to learn them, all 20 or 30 of them, the morning of the quiz isn't going to be as effective. Something called the serial position effect also takes a part or a role in encoding information. It's the tendency to recall best the last and first items on the list. The last items because they're the most recent in your memory, and the first items on a list because you've had the most time to rehearse them. So if I were to give you this list, which if you were in class, this is what I would do. I would let you read the list one time through, and then on a piece of paper, try and recall as many of the items as possible without looking at the screen. What we tend to find is that a lot of people will remember the items at the beginning of the list and at the very end of the list, but the ones in the middle, especially like cat and book and ball, those ones are oftentimes left off the list. I put the word outrageous in the middle just because it oftentimes does stand out to you. It's the longest word. It's a different word. It's the word outrageous, and many people will remember that even if it is in the middle. Ebbinghaus is an important figure. His name is Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he studied memory. He's one of the names that you'll need to remember from this chapter. And he came up with the retention curve. And basically the idea is As rehearsal increases, relearning time decreases, and this really holds true for how we try and prepare for the AP exam. We continually rehearse information all the way back to the prologue. We're trying to get you to think about and remember and rehearse and practice the previous chapters. And we find that you are going to forget information. However, the more we rehearse it, if you do need to relearn it, it's going to take you less time. So really the point to remember with Ebbinghaus's retention curve is that if you spend a good amount of time learning the information with meaning, if you do forget it, you're going to recall it a lot faster with less effort. All right, when we talk about encoding, we talk about visual encoding, we use imagery, mental pictures. And I know a lot of us can relate to thinking about something and having some kind of visual picture come to mind. When you think about past events, there's something called rosy retrospection, and how people will recall events more positively than they evaluated them at the time they occurred. And that's kind of nice, is looking at our past through rose-colored lenses. So if you think about your junior prom, let's say, a lot of you will tend to remember the good and forget the bad. If you think back to, your kindergarten year, if you do remember kindergarten, you're going to remember the good things that happened in kindergarten versus the bad things that happened. Organizationally, we use mnemonic devices to help us visually encode. They're memory aids using vivid imagery and organization. So whether or not you close your eyes and can think of some kind of mnemonic device that would help you, whether it's, what am I trying to say? Give some examples, Lund. Memorizing the planets. My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas, even though Pluto isn't a planet anymore. That was a mnemonic device. I remember the Every Good Boy Does Fine, the notes on the treble clef. Those are kinds of mnemonic devices that we think about that help us recall information. Chunking, it's when we naturally organize items into familiar, manageable units. And oftentimes this happens without even thinking about it too. When you think of how we organize our phone numbers, 651, 252, 2810, we chunk them together. Social security numbers. When we organize them into something familiar and meaningful, it allows for us to remember them easier. Hierarchies. This is another way we visually encode information by taking the broad concept and dividing it and subdividing it into narrow concepts and facts. Our books do this with the chapter title being the broad concept, and then you've got major headings that are then subdivided into narrower concepts and fields. And I've got some other slides that show this. Here are some of those mnemonic devices that I forgot about. The method of loci is actually a method that was used by Greek orators that had to memorize lengthy speeches that were hours long. And they actually used visual imagery of walking through a building, and one room would be a retrieval cue for them to talk about a certain point. They'd go into another room, and that would serve as a retrieval cue for another talking point. So that is on our vocab sheet, I'm pretty sure, the method of loci. Here's a chunking list that organizes them into a familiar list. It's much easier to remember this list in familiar categories than this list. So that just gives you a chunking example. And then here's a hierarchy example, and how it has a main heading like encoding, then it's broken down into meaning, imagery, and organization, and then even organization broken down to chunks and hierarchies. So this is it. Perfect.